See, standards govern every part of our lives, whether it's driving on a particular side of the road or the food, etc., etc. Basically, a standard is something that everybody agrees upon and implements, so that that what to expect. I know what to expect. So open standards are basically standards which are free of royalties. And in the IT industry, what has happened is that because the industry is fairly young, you've had a number of standards which are owned and controlled by vendors. And over a period of time, as e-government and other methods become more popular, where a lot of people have to interact with each other, you need open standards which are free of royalties so that people can interact more freely with each other. With proprietary standards where you have to pay royalties, the issue is that the cost of IT becomes much higher. So for example, today you can implement a Linux desktop for free anywhere that you want. But if you want to purchase the multimedia rights, the rights to use the popular multimedia formats, your cost sometimes goes up to about 1,600 rupees for the right to use the multimedia codecs and the formats legally. So that is a serious issue in a country like India, because you can use open source software and open standards to reduce the digital divide. But if you use proprietary software and proprietary standards, the cost of sharing information, the cost of digitizing the economy, taking IT to the masses, bridging the digital divide, that becomes extremely high, which we can't as a country afford. So that's why open standards are important. So if you look at some of the most popular technologies in the world of computers, I guess clearly the most popular one is the internet. And that was created using a format called HTML, which was freely available to everybody. The standard can be implemented by anybody without paying any royalties. The specification of how do you implement HTML is freely available to a whole world of developers. So if that's why you've seen so much of creativity happening with the web, exploding to such a extent today that there are almost 1.2 billion or about close to about 1.4 billion people who are connected to the internet today. So that dissemination of knowledge has happened because there is absolutely unfettered right to use the standards, implement them in whatever software you want, whether that is proprietary standards or open standards. So nowadays what is happening is that when it comes to e-government, for example, a lot of documents are being created, a lot of data is being shared between different e-government systems. And governments are realizing that if they store their data in proprietary formats, there are several challenges. So one challenge is that the proprietary vendor whose formats are being used, if he goes out of business, then who continues to maintain that particular standard? And government data, the critical thing about government data is that the longevity of that data is not is very it's not a short time, it's actually long time. It could be 10 years, it could be 20 years, it could be even 100 years. In fact, in India we are still using the land records which were created by Raja Todarmal, which was about the reign of Emperor Akbar, which was almost 400 years ago. So the longevity of e-government data is means that you have to have special care to govern that particular data. You have to ensure that how that data is stored, how that data will be retrieved 50 years from now, how it will be retrieved maybe 100 years from now. The governance of that data is extremely important when it comes to e-government. So many governments are realizing that unless they store their data in public formats that are well understood, known, are free from royalties and those kind of encumbrances, the risk is that they will create a mountain of data and one day end up losing it, or because the person or the company which owns that particular format has disappeared, or that because the royalty fees that are being charged on that format are extremely high. So by using open standards, you can completely avoid all these issues. Many of us have gone through multiple generations of word processors. So when I started using computers, the word processor I used was WordStar on DOS. And with every change in the application software, I have lost my data. Maybe part of it because I didn't have the time to actually convert it from a WordStar to a WordPerfect to some other formats. So with every change, I have lost data. Every generation of software that I've used, I've kept on. But if you look at the internet, you can still see the first website that Tim Berners-Lee created. This was maybe 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
And even with the most modern of browsers, you can still see the earliest of web pages. And that is because these are all built using open standards, which are royalty free and which have been implemented by people across the years. So I think that is the real value of open standards, that it encourages the preservation of data. The difference between open standards and open source is that when we talk of open standards, we are primarily talking of data, how that data is stored, retrieved, archived, and encoded. So open standards basically deals with the retrieval of information and data, whereas open source is basically the ability to modify the source code of software. You have open standards. The thing is, it does not preclude anybody from competing or anybody from implementing it. It basically enables competition. So open standards basically can be implemented by proprietary software vendors as well as open source software vendors. And that's where what you see with browsers, for example. A format like HTML, which is open, it's clearly available. It's it's very well understood. It's implemented by thousands of developers. The knowledge is there. It's freely shared. It's so if I want to implement HTML, it's public knowledge. Whereas a proprietary format like .doc is a trade secret. So the value of open standards for society is that we are a society that believes in free speech. So I think something like a proprietary standard actually militates against that, because your freedom to talk to each other in the digital world is mediated through standards which are owned and controlled by somebody else, and indirectly or directly you're paying a royalty on that. For example, formats like MPEG, etc. If you buy a DVD player, almost half the cost of a DVD player is basically royalties. So you're actually paying for thin air in some ways. And with the situation like the government of India's, where we are still kind of at the beginning of e-governance, and we are still not created like that humongous amounts of data. So if we store it in a format which is proprietary like MP3, eventually the royalty payments on that format could be huge for the country as a whole.